Joyce's paper invites us to expand our horizons in terms of looking at the question of slavery and in some ways taking us out of what is the traditional narrative in American history, which is to look at slavery basically as simply as a prelude to the Civil War. That is, one of the preoccupations of the American historical profession has always been to what extent does slavery contribute to the Civil War? Could the Civil War in some ways have been avoided? What I want to do is to also invite us, as we think of the issue of slavery, and particularly what legacy slavery bequeaths to American race relations, to also get us beyond that antebellum narrative and to expand our horizons in two ways. One, to look at Latin America. One of the things that I think that we don't do or don't do enough, those of us who have been trained in U.S. history, is to realize that the slave experience in the United States is actually a relatively small part of a much bigger picture that occurs hemisphere-wide. Something like no more than 5 or 6% of the Africans who are brought to the Americas are brought to what is now the United States. And the figures that demographic historians give us for the number of Africans who are brought to the Americas locate somewhere between 10 and 12 million in some 4 centuries of the African slave trade, but only about 500,000 or 600,000 of those actually come to what is the United States. Brazil, which I'm going to be drawing a contrast with, draws a much larger percentage of the African slave trade, some 4 to 6 million individuals, or 40% or better of the African slave trade. So in some ways it's a much longer slave experience, beginning at the start of the 15th century, and in fact actually something that one has to in fact extend back to metropolitan Portugal. That is, there are African slaves at the beginning of the 15th century in metropolitan Portugal, and perhaps more importantly in the Azores, where the Portuguese start the model for New World sugar plantation slavery in the Azores, and then transported to Brazil in the 16th century. So they have more than a century of experience with African slavery by the time they begin their exploration and settlement of Brazil. By way of contrast, we commonly take the 1620s as the start of slavery in what would become the United States. Slavery in Brazil also lasts a generation after Appomattox, with final abolition coming in Brazil in 1888. So it takes place over a much longer period of time with a much more intense African slave trade, if you will. And by the way, this history also has to be engaged with respect to the rest of the hemisphere as well. I'm simply talking about a fairly small part of what we're doing, which is the Brazil-U.S. contrast, but there are significant contrasts to be made, obviously, with the British Caribbean, Spanish America, the French colonies, and also, interestingly enough, Dutch and Danish colonies as well in the Americas. The project that I'm working on, I'm doing this with Tanya Hernandez of Fordham Law School, is not so much a study of slavery as such, but how slavery, what is slavery's impact in terms of race relations, and an impact that goes on, in fact, till the present. I think those of you who are familiar with Frank Tannenbaum and his Slave and Citizen, who in the 1940s first perhaps sort of systematizes the comparative question, how does slavery help shape race relations in the Americas? And Tannenbaum is very critical rather, in the formation of the racial democracy thesis that we can look at the nations of Latin America, including Brazil, as racial democracies as opposed to the much more rigidly segregated United States. I think it's fair to say that looking back on it, Tannenbaum is very much a product of the 1940s when he's writing and he's contrasting the Jim Crow United States with a Latin America that doesn't have that kind of formal discrimination, even though post Jim Crow in the United States, I think research has shown far more in the way of racial inequality in Latin America than perhaps we previously thought at one point. But there is an integration, or at least a surface integration, of free people of African descent in Latin America that certainly is absent in the 19th century U.S., the Cotton Kingdom, and also the areas outside of the Cotton Kingdom, including the Free States. That is there's a racial openness, at least for some people of African descent in Latin America, that is not present in the United States, the antebellum United States. And I think the historical differences between Brazil and the United States in the 19th century might be neatly encapsulated by two occurrences that occur in both countries in the middle of the 19th century. The first of these occurrences that I would draw your attention to is the Taney opinion in Dred Scott. And Taney in Dred Scott essentially precludes the possibility of Negro citizenship. He argues that essentially that slavery and citizenship are incompatible, and therefore that the framers could not have meant to include blacks within the definition of citizenship. I think a look at the founding period is a lot more complex than Taney gives it credit for, and I would simply say that every northern state, and indeed a majority of states, north and south, allow free black men to vote on the same basis as whites in the late 18th century, which presents a much more complex picture than the one Taney is giving us. But nonetheless, we do have the Dred Scott decision in 1857, which in some ways I think crystallizes this view of blacks as the permanent outsider, the permanent non-citizen. I would contrast that with the career of one individual, Antonio Pereira Rebouças, whose biography is captured by Brazilian historian Kayla Greenberg in her book O Fiador dos Brasileiros. Rebouças is interesting. He is a free Afro-Brazilian. He is a mulatto, but he's more than simply a free man. He is clearly a citizen. He is a prominent lawyer in Brazil. He's a member of the National Congress, and he's an advisor to the emperor. He is also a small slaveholder, an opponent of racial discrimination, and a man who is suspicious and fearful of what he sees as African barbarism. So how do we get that combination in Brazil in what is at base a system of race-based slavery, not that dissimilar in some ways from the United States, but yet just simply if we look at Rebouças, very dissimilar. There's no equivalent of Rebouças in antebellum America. Rebouças embodies the contradictions that are the Brazilian Empire. It's an empire governed by the Constitution of 1824, which implicitly recognizes race-based slavery, and yet also